Hello, and welcome to Ars Lyrica's series, Musical Moments. Today, we'll be looking at instruments of the 18th century, and I'm your host, Kathleen Staton. The 18th century was a time of great change across all societies in Europe. It was a shift from ornate opulence that originated at court and in the church to an age of the common man. It was also the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Many things that we think of today were actually invented at the end of the 18th century, things from steamships to even soda pop. But we're focusing on instruments today. Even instruments had massive changes in their technology. When we think of inventions, we think of things like the cotton gin or of major medical advances that changed our everyday lives. But instruments were very much the same way. As people became more cultured and more refined with the rise of the middle class during this time, so too did the instruments. Whether it was the invention of the piano or adding 8 keys to flutes, instruments began to change and evolve in order to incorporate and allow a greater virtuosity and emotional expression in music. Did you know that the piano was actually invented in the early 1700s? The piano, of course, is a keyboard instrument we all know well, but it had its beginnings much earlier than we might have thought, and it wasn't a clear-cut switch from the harpsichord to the piano. There were many iterations or changes in the instrument as it went along. Let's have a look at the harpsichord, which is where a lot of the music that Ars Lyrica performs begins. The harpsichord was a keyboard instrument in which the strings are plucked with a quill rather than hit with a hammer like a piano. Did you know that inside of the harpsichord were actually quills? A lot of instruments used animals as the source for their materials. Just like the violins and cellos that we hear play in the orchestra, the strings were not made of steel like they're made of steel today, but rather of animal gut, of sheep's gut. And in fact, our musicians who play in the orchestra still have strings that are made that way. The harpsichord sometimes had 1 or 2 keyboards, and that allowed for a greater range of strings. That meant that you could have some more dynamics on this instrument that was really much more of an on or an off. It did not allow for a lot of expression and had a very unique sound. Sometimes the cases or the box in which the harpsichords were in were very ornate, and other times they could be quite plain. As you can imagine, it just depended on how much money you had to spend on your harpsichord. In this interesting diagram, you can see inside the harpsichord itself. Each one of those harpsichord jacks is what allows for the key to be struck and then to pluck the quill. Have a look inside a piano sometime and compare. A hammer inside of the piano that's shaped almost like a mini tomahawk or an axe will come down and strike the string as opposed to inside the harpsichord. Let's listen to Ars Lyrica's Matthew Durst perform an Italian piece on the harpsichord. This piece has all of the notes in the scale, or also known as very chromatic, and will have a distinctly different sound from the music that we're about to hear next. The music of the 17th century was meant to evoke or create very specific emotions in its listener. It was about that drawing out of human feeling that was the most important aspect of compositional style. As we change to the Enlightenment and to the 18th century, it becomes more about symmetry and clarity and reason instead of emotion. And we're going to hear that shift as we move from the harpsichord to the forte piano. The French forte piano was said to have been invented around the early 1700s by Bartolomeo Cristofari. It's famous for being more closely related to the piano than to the harpsichord because of a few key factors. Inside of a piano is a huge iron plate that allows for a higher string tension. That string tension has a lot of different effects, including allowance for more dynamic range, as well as an even higher pitch. The higher the pitch, the brighter and more engaging the sound is. An interesting note is that the harpsichord is a full half step below the sound of the piano. As we move through history, the pitch goes higher. So the forte piano is often tuned at A430. That's a quarter tone between the pitches of the Baroque and the modern day. Their action, or how much effort it took to move the keys, was lighter and more responsive than the harpsichord. If you play the piano, you'll notice that you can get a very soft and delicate sound or a hard and percussive sound, depending on how hard you push the keys. That wasn't very true of the harpsichord at all, and with the invention of the forte piano, you gain more and more range of expression, both in dynamics as well as in attack and articulation. Those aren't words that you often think about with keyboard instruments, but they're just as relevant to creating the soundscape that we know in the music we hear. Let's take a listen now to Matthew Durst performing with Barrett Sills, who is also on our Bastille Day program, a Beethoven trio called the Ghost Trio, and see if you can figure out what the words would be to describe the difference between the sound of the forte piano and the harpsichord. Did you notice the change in textures? Sometimes the forte piano had trills up at the top, that little sparkling sound that were very high and light and fast and dynamic. Other times it was a louder bass, but still very clear down there. One of the other things that you might have noticed about the music was that it was in a clear meter. You could sort of clap along. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And if you watch the musicians, you could notice that their bodies were moving in a way that said, we're coming to the middle of a phrase, and now we're coming back. And now here we are moving towards something, and then coming to an end. In the Rossi that we heard Matthew Durst perform earlier in this program, it was much more winding and like a maze of harmonies and melody. You never knew exactly where you were or where you were going to end up. So that's one of the ways that the music began to change during this time period. So we see a big evolution in the keyboard instruments, but we also see a big change in the wind instruments. Let's hear a word from Colin St. Martin, our flute player, about the instrument he's performing on for this Bastille Day concert.
Hi, my name is Colin St. Martin, and I'm a traverso player. Though the instrument that I have in my hand, I'm not sure if that qualifies as a traverso. I think what a lot of people consider that instrument is a one-keyed flute, which came into being around the end of the 17th century and existed pretty much up until Beethoven's time. But by the end of the 18th century, they started adding more keys. So the earlier flute just had this one E-flat D-sharp key. But as the century went on, some flute makers, I guess because of the desires of certain players and maybe certain composers, they started adding keys to the instrument, basically to do two things. One, to make notes that would ordinarily be on the soft side, without them, to make them a little louder. But it also, for the musicians out there, having the keys make certain slurs much easier to do. That is, instead of having to use my tongue to articulate every note, I can slide over things much more easily with use of the keys. Or that is, if I were as used to them as I should be, because I don't play this instrument very often. But what I actually have in my hand today is an actual 18th century instrument. It's from about 1780. It was made by the workshop of Richard Potter. He started making instruments in London around 1745 or so, and made instruments well into the end of the century, and then was taken over by another family member, then another family member into the 19th century. So it was a long-standing business. And this instrument has 6 keys. So it has the E-flat D-sharp key, but it also goes down to middle C with these 2 keys here. There's an F natural key, there's a G sharp key, and then there's a little B flat key. More keys were also extant at the end of the 18th century, depending on the player and depending what your budget was, because putting keys on an instrument was expensive. If you could afford it, then you might want to have more bells and whistles as usual, or have engraved keys or whatever to make the instrument fancier and more decorative. So the sound and the design, other than the key work that I just discussed, are ostensibly identical to that earlier one-keyed flute. And indeed, Richard Potter did make one-keyed flutes as well, but this was definitely his most successful model, shall we say. And apparently the gentleman who commissioned one of the Mozart flute concerti had this very instrument, because as you probably know, the flute and harp concerto in C major by Mozart goes down to middle C, which on a regular traverso wouldn't be possible, so you'd have to leave those notes out. So in any event, that's this instrument, and I'll play a couple little things just so you can get a difference between a Baroque flute and this classical late 18th century flute. So here's a little passage. Say, because I can play it like a Baroque flute. I'm going to play it like a Baroque flute. So. But since I have this handy-dandy G sharp key, I can do this. So you hear that difference. Same thing with B flat. And as I said, it goes down lower. It's very soft right now. You might notice these keys make a lot of clacking noise because it's 2 pieces of metal hitting one another. And you have to put a little bit of oil on them periodically, and it doesn't eliminate the noise, but it greatly reduces it. And of course, some of you out there might ask, well, why on earth would they have metal hitting metal? The simple reason is because these keys have to remain open most of the time. The little leather pieces that would sit on them, which is the way any kind of wind instrument created a seal with a key, they would dry out on these instruments, so when you went to press them, they wouldn't actually seal. So what Potter, or at least we believe he was the inventor of this, came up with these little pewter plugs. So this little piece of pewter goes into the hole, which is shaped exactly like the shape of the plug, like an old apothecary bottle where the glass is ground so it fits hermetically on top. Same deal here, but they can be a little noisy. So anyway, that's Richard Potter's six-keyed flute, late 18th century design, and thank you very much for listening and watching.
You may be wondering what Colin meant when he said, I'm going to play it the Baroque way, or the way that it sounds with all of the keys. So a Baroque flute only had one key, which meant that it was very challenging to create some of those more chromatic sounding notes on a wind instrument. Also, the shape of the flute changes, which allows in the later music for the flute to have a higher range, and then the addition of the keys, as Colin said, allows also for a lower range. If you were looking carefully, you might have noticed that the middle joint of Colin's flute was a completely different color than the rest of the flute. Well, it turns out that more than the key work is historical. Also, the way that the wood is treated and the kind of wood that instruments are built out of requires special dyes and stains. And those dyes and stains are not always as consistent as they would be in the modern day. They actually use nitric acid to stain the wood a different color. And sometimes, just like if you're developing your own photos in a lab, the exposure goes on longer than you'd like it to. So Colin has a multicolored flute, but it's all made of the same wood. We have one more instrument that rounds out our trio of instruments for this Bastille Day concert, and that's the cello. The cello itself doesn't necessarily look like it has evolved or changed very much, but in reality it has. Aside from changing the strings, also the bow changes, and so does the addition of an end pin, which allows for more stability for the player as history goes on. But Barry, our cellist, is going to tell you something even more fascinating. Let's hear from him.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to emerge from my pandemic cave and be able to participate with Ars Lyrica this summer. I was asked about my cello, an instrument which many of you who have heard Ars Lyrica concerts through the years probably know. It is an instrument that's distinctive in its huge bass sound. It's an 18th century Italian cello. It has a label that says it's a Guadagnini cello, but we've verified that it's not actually that. But it's a magnificent 18th century Italian cello, and I've had it since I was 17 years old. Oh my gosh. It's been a stormy relationship through the years with this instrument. I struggled with it for many years, trying to play it at A440 pitch, and it just was very stubborn and didn't really want to cooperate. Plus the fact that it's made with poplar wood on the back, which gives it a rich, creamy sound, but it also is more susceptible to humidity because it absorbs moisture from the air. So it's really a disaster if the weather turns bad. So you can see it's been quite an albatross for me during the years. I finally abandoned it, and many years later, somebody suggested I try it as a Baroque instrument. I tuned it down to A415, that half step lower, and it just opened up. It was unhappy at a higher pitch. So that's what it was about. And I'm so thankful that I hung on to it. I was wanting to sell it all those years. And it's a problematic market, instruments like that. So I never did sell it. I still have it, and I use it. I love it. It's my Baroque cello. Thanks.
A large part of what we do as historical performers is not just playing and practicing or even learning about performance practice like phrasing and trills and ornamentation, but we're also like detectives trying to figure out exactly how these instruments were made, what they were made of, and how they were tuned, because all of these pieces come together to create the perfect, most beautiful puzzle of recreating the music of the time. For more information on these instruments, you can click on the link in the description of this video to find supplementary materials. We hope you'll join us for our Bastille Day concert, and if you have any questions, please reach out to us directly. We'd love to talk with you more about historical performance. Thanks for watching.